The funeral home smelled wrong. Not just the usual chemical sweetness of formaldehyde and lilies, but something else underneath. Something earthy and wild, like wet leaves and copper pennies. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand still on the brass handle, fighting the urge to turn around and drive the 6 hours back to Phoenix. Her grandmother's casket sat at the front of the room, surrounded by flowers that looked too bright under the fluorescent lights. But it was the people that made Sarah's skin crawl. Faces she'd known since childhood, all turned toward her with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Smiles that lasted a beat too long. "Sarah, honey." Mrs. Chun from the corner store approached with arms outstretched. She'd aged 20 years in the five since Sarah had last seen her, but her grip was still strong enough to bruise. "So sorry about Eleanor. She was special." The pause made Sarah's stomach tighten. Behind Mrs. Chun, she could see Jake fidgeting near the guest book, his 17-year-old frame dwarfed by the heavy velvet curtains. He kept glancing toward the corners of the room like he was watching for something. "Before we get into this true story from Millfield, Arizona, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Are you listening alone? Are the lights on? Good. Keep them on." Okay, let's get started with the story of Sarah Martinez, who thought she was coming home for a funeral, but discovered some family traditions are better left buried. Sarah had been putting off this trip for months. Every phone call from her grandmother had been shorter, more confused. Eleanor would ask about Sarah's mother, who'd been dead for 15 years. She'd mention neighbors who'd moved away decades ago, as if they'd stopped by for coffee that morning. The assisted living facility had been patient, but when they found Eleanor wandering the halls at 3 a.m., asking for her old friend in the woods, they'd called Sarah. "Mom couldn't visit," Sarah had explained to the funeral director that morning. "She died when I was 22. The man had nodded, but his eyes had that same too bright quality she'd noticed in Mrs. Chun. Of course, Eleanor mentioned that. Said she'd been talking to her lately. Sarah had chalked it up to dementia. Now, standing in this room full of faces that felt like masks, she wasn't so sure. Jake appeared at her elbow. "Can we go now? This place gives me the creeps." She wanted to say yes. Wanted to grab her son and drive straight through the night until they were back in their safe, normal life in Phoenix. But her grandmother had been the last link to her childhood, and some part of Sarah needed to understand why Eleanor had spent her final weeks talking about the woods behind their old house. "We'll stay for the service tomorrow," she said. "Then we can leave." Jake's face fell. "Do we have to stay at the house? Can't we get a hotel?" Sarah looked around the room. The nearest hotel was 40 miles away in Flagstaff. And besides, she'd already promised the realtor she'd clean out the house before putting it on the market. "Two birds, one stone. It's just for one night," she said. "Maybe two." That evening, they drove through downtown Millfield as the sun set behind the mountains. The town looked smaller than Sarah remembered, shabbier. Half the storefronts were empty, their windows covered with newspaper or plywood. But the people were still there, standing in doorways and on porches, watching their rental car pass with that same too bright attention. "They're staring," Jake muttered from the passenger seat. Sarah had noticed it too. Not just curious glances, but focused attention, like they were being evaluated, measured. Her grandmother's house sat on 3 acres at the end of Maple Street, where the pavement gave way to dirt and the desert began to reclaim the land. The white clapboard siding had weathered to gray, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of 40 winters. But the porch light was on, casting long shadows across the yard. "Did you call ahead?" Jake asked. "To have the power turned on?" Sarah shook her head. The utility company had told her it would take 3 business days to reconnect service. She brought camping gear, expecting to rough it. They climbed the porch steps, the old wood creaking under their feet. Sarah found the spare key under the ceramic frog where her grandmother had always kept it. The front door swung open with a sound like a sigh. The house smelled like her childhood, lavender sachets and old wood, and something else she couldn't place. Something that reminded her of the forest behind the house, of mushrooms growing in dark places. "Electricity's working," Jake said, flipping a switch. The living room filled with warm yellow light, revealing furniture covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Sarah pulled the sheet off the couch, releasing a cloud of dust and that strange earthy scent. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The landscape paintings on the walls, the collection of ceramic owls on the mantel, the old rocking chair by the window where her grandmother used to sit and watch the tree line. "I'm hungry," Jake announced, heading for the kitchen. Sarah followed him, pulling out her phone to order pizza. No signal. She'd forgotten how spotty cell service was out here, surrounded by mountains and miles of empty desert. The kitchen was pristine, which was strange. Eleanor had been in the assisted living facility for 6 months. Who had been maintaining the house? The refrigerator hummed with life, and when Sarah opened it, she found it fully stocked. Milk that wouldn't expire for another week. Fresh fruit. A casserole dish covered with foil. "Weird," Jake said, opening the foil. Still warm. Sarah's skin prickled. The casserole was her grandmother's green bean recipe, complete with the crispy onions on top that Eleanor had made every Thanksgiving. But Eleanor had been dead for 3 days. "Neighbors, probably," Sarah said, though her voice sounded uncertain even to her. "Small town thing." They ate in silence. The only sound the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of the house settling. Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see the edge of the forest, a black wall against the star-filled sky. "No moon tonight." "Mom," Jake said suddenly, "did you know Grandpa?" The question caught her off guard. "Your grandfather died before you were born, honey, before I even met your father. But you knew him, right? When you were a kid?" Sarah set down her fork. "No, he died when I was 7. "What?" Jake pushed food around his plate. "Grandma used to talk about him. Said he was waiting for me to visit." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. When did she say that? Last Christmas. And the Christmas before. She said. Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said he had things to teach me. Family things." Sarah reached across the table and took her son's hand. "Jake, your grandfather's been dead for 30 years. Grandma was. She was getting confused toward the end. The doctor said." A sound from upstairs cut her off. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor of what had been her grandmother's bedroom. They both froze. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered. Sarah nodded. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth across the ceiling above them. Then they stopped. Silence. "Stay here," Sarah said, standing up. "Mom, don't." But she was already moving toward the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The steps creaked under her feet, each sound echoing in the stillness. The hallway upstairs was dark, but she could see a line of light under the door to her grandmother's room. She pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. Sarah turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the bed was unmade, the covers thrown back as if someone had just gotten up. And on the nightstand, a glass of water sat next to a book, its pages still turning in a breeze she couldn't feel. She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The book was a leather journal, filled with her grandmother's handwriting. Sarah picked it up, squinting at the cramped script. They're getting restless. The old agreement is fraying at the edges. Jacob will be 18 soon. The time is coming. Jacob. Jake's full name. Sarah flipped through more pages, her hands trembling. The Henley boy was taken last month. They found him in the woods, but it wasn't really him. Martha says she can tell the difference, but I know better. They're getting better at it. More convincing. The families are scared. They want to break the covenant, but they don't understand what will happen if we do. What came before the agreement? We're holding back. Sarah's throat felt dry. She turned to the last entry, dated just a week ago. Sarah will bring the boy home. She won't understand at first. She never learned the old ways. Never wanted to hear about the forest and what lives there. But blood calls to blood. The Nakani have been patient, but patience has limits. If we don't give them what was promised, they'll take what they want. Jacob has the sight. I can see it in his eyes when he visits. He sees things others can't, just like his grandfather did, just like I do. The teaching will begin tonight. The journal slipped from Sarah's hands and hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the hallway was empty, except for the sound of Jake's voice drifting up from the kitchen below. He was talking to someone. Sarah moved to the top of the stairs, straining to hear. Jake's voice was animated, excited. He was asking questions, laughing at responses she couldn't hear. "Jake," she called out. The conversation stopped. "I'm in the kitchen, Mom," Jake called back, but his voice sounded different. Older somehow, more confident. Sarah hurried down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the wood. The kitchen was empty except for Jake, who sat at the table with a smile on his face. "Who were you talking to?" she asked. Jake's smile faltered for just a moment. "Nobody. Just thinking out loud." But there were 2 glasses on the table now. 2 plates. Jake's was empty, but the other still had food on it, as if someone had been interrupted mid-bite. "Jake, who was here?" "Nobody, Mom. I told you." His voice had an edge now, defensive. "You're being paranoid." Sarah looked at the extra place setting, then back at her son. In the overhead light, his face looked different, sharper somehow. His eyes held a knowledge that hadn't been there an hour ago. "I'm tired," she said finally. "We should get some sleep." Jake nodded and stood up, but he moved differently now, more carefully, like he was thinking about each step. They cleaned up in silence, loading the dishwasher and wiping down the counters. Sarah kept glancing at Jake out of the corner of her eye, but he seemed normal again, just a tired teenager ready for bed. "I'll take Grandma's room," Sarah said. "You can have the guest room." "Actually," Jake said, pausing at the bottom of the stairs, "I was thinking I'd sleep in Grandpa's old room, the one in the basement." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "How do you know about that room?" Jake blinked, and for a moment he looked genuinely confused. I don't know. I just knew." He frowned, pressing his fingers to his temples. "Is that weird?" Sarah forced herself to sound calm. "There's no bed down there, honey. Just storage." "Oh." Jake looked disappointed. "Okay, guest room then." They went upstairs together, but Sarah waited in the hallway until she heard Jake's door close and the sound of him settling into bed. Then she went back to her grandmother's room and locked the door behind her. She tried to sleep, but every sound made her jump. The house was full of noises, settling wood, scratching in the walls, the whisper of wind through cracks she couldn't see. And underneath it all, she could swear she heard footsteps, soft ones, moving through the house like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Around midnight, she heard Jake's door open. Sarah sat up in bed, listening. Soft footsteps in the hallway. Then the creak of the stairs as someone descended toward the first floor. She got up and pressed her ear to her door. The footsteps continued downstairs, then stopped. A moment later, she heard the soft squeak of a door opening. The basement door. Sarah grabbed her phone and used its flashlight to navigate the dark hallway. Jake's room was empty, his bed covers thrown back. She could hear voices now, coming from somewhere deep in the house. One of them was definitely Jake's. The other was older, deeper, familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. She crept down the stairs, following the sound. The basement door stood open, revealing a rectangle of deeper darkness. The voices were clearer now, echoing up from below. "Teach you the old ways," the deeper voice was saying. "The ways your grandmother never shared with your mother." "Why didn't she tell Mom?" Jake asked. "Because your mother has forgotten what she is. Forgotten what this family owes. What we've always owed." Sarah's hand found the light switch at the top of the basement stairs. She flicked it on, and yellow light spilled down the wooden steps. "Jake," she called out. "Come up here. Now." The voices stopped. "Jake." "Coming, Mom." Jake's voice called back, but it sounded wrong. Too far away, like it was coming from somewhere else entirely. Sarah started down the stairs, her bare feet silent on the painted wood. The basement was exactly as she remembered. Concrete walls, exposed beams, boxes stacked everywhere. But in the far corner, where her grandfather's workshop had been, she could see a light. Not electric light, something warmer, flickering. She moved toward it, her phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The smell was stronger down here, that earthy, wild scent she'd noticed at the funeral home, like something that had been buried and recently dug up. The workshop was empty except for an old workbench and a collection of tools hanging on the wall. But on the bench, a candle burned in a glass jar. Next to it lay a collection of items that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Bones, small ones, arranged in careful patterns. Feathers from birds she didn't recognize. And photographs. Dozens of them, all of Jake. Some looked like they'd been taken recently. Others seemed impossible. Jake as a baby, though Sarah was sure she'd never brought him to Millfield as an infant. "Mom." Sarah spun around. Jake stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking confused and sleepy. "What are you doing down here?" she asked. "I heard voices. I thought you were talking to someone." Sarah looked back at the workbench. The candle was gone. The bones, the feathers, the photographs, all of it had vanished. Just an empty wooden surface covered in dust. "We need to leave," she said. "Right now." "But Mom." "Right now, Jake." They packed in silence, throwing clothes and toiletries into their bags with trembling hands. Sarah kept glancing out the windows, expecting to see faces in the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the black wall of the forest and the star-filled sky. As they loaded the car, Jake paused at the passenger door. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think Grandpa is really dead?" Sarah's hand stilled on her suitcase. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Jake looked toward the house, then back at her. "I keep feeling like he's watching. Like he's been watching for a long time." Sarah followed his gaze to the house. In the living room window, she could see the silhouette of the rocking chair, and sitting in it, barely visible in the darkness, was the outline of a figure. Watching them. Waiting. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the car. "Get in. Now." They drove through Millfield in silence, the empty streets lit only by scattered streetlights. But as they passed the downtown area, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. Lights were on in the houses. Not just porch lights, but interior lights. In living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms. As if the entire town was awake, watching them leave. And in some of those windows, Sarah could see figures. Motionless shapes that turned to follow their car as it passed. Jake was quiet until they reached the highway. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not going to let us go, are they?" Sarah pressed down on the accelerator, but her eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror. The town was disappearing behind them, swallowed by darkness and distance. But she could still feel those eyes watching, still feel something following. "Mom," Jake said again, "what did Grandpa want to teach me?" And in the darkness of the car, with 40 miles of empty desert stretching ahead of them, Sarah realized she didn't know. But she was terrified she was about to find out. They made it 20 miles before the car started making sounds. First, a subtle knock in the engine, then a grinding that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah pulled over to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking against the vast darkness of the desert. "What's wrong?" Jake asked. Sarah turned the key. Nothing. Not even the click of a dead battery. She tried again. The engine turned over once, twice, then died with a sound like a sigh. "Shit," she whispered. Jake pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course there wasn't. They were in the middle of nowhere, with empty desert stretching in all directions, and not a single light visible except for the stars overhead. Sarah got out and popped the hood, though she knew nothing about engines. The metal was cold under her hands, and when she shone her phone's flashlight into the engine compartment, everything looked normal. No obvious leaks, no disconnected wires. But something was wrong with the smell. That same earthy, wild scent she'd been noticing all day was stronger here, clinging to the metal like fog. "Mom," Jake said from inside the car, "I think someone's coming." Sarah looked up. In the distance, headlights were approaching from the direction of Millfield, moving slowly, deliberately, like whoever was driving had all the time in the world. "Get in," she said. She tried the key again. This time, the engine caught. Sarah didn't wait to see if it would hold. She threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. In the rearview mirror, she could see the other vehicle speeding up, its headlights growing larger. "Who was that?" Jake asked, turning to look behind them. "I don't know." But she did know. Or at least, she suspected. The way the headlights moved, the deliberate pace of the pursuit. It felt like they were being herded rather than chased. The engine made another grinding sound, and the car lurched. Sarah pressed harder on the gas, but their speed was dropping. 50 miles per hour. 40. 30. Behind them, the pursuing vehicle was gaining ground. "There," Jake said, pointing ahead. A truck stop. Sarah saw it. A cluster of lights in the darkness, probably the only business for 50 miles in any direction. She coaxed the dying car into the parking lot, pulling up next to a semi-truck whose driver was nowhere to be seen. The engine died as soon as she turned off the key. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the road. The pursuing vehicle had stopped just beyond the truck stop's lights, its headlights still visible, but no longer moving. "Come on," Sarah said. "Let's see if we can get help." The truck stop was one of those all-night places that served long-haul drivers and anyone else desperate enough to stop in the middle of nowhere. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white relief. The clerk behind the counter was reading a paperback novel and didn't look up when they entered. "Excuse me," Sarah said. "Our car broke down. Is there a mechanic nearby?" The clerk glanced up. He was older, with weathered skin and eyes that seemed too knowing. "At this hour? You'll have to wait until morning. Jimmy's shop is back in Millfield. Is there anywhere else we can stay?" "A motel. Nothing between here and Flagstaff." The clerk studied her face. "You're Eleanor's granddaughter, aren't you?" Sarah's stomach tightened. "How did you? You look like her." "Same eyes." The clerk smiled, but like everyone else in Millfield, it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Tom. I knew your grandmother well. Real well. We were just leaving town," Sarah said carefully. "Were you now?" Tom's gaze shifted to Jake, who was browsing the candy aisle with nervous energy. "And taking the boy with you?" It wasn't a question. "He's my son. Eleanor's great-grandson," Tom said. The last of the line. Sarah felt cold spreading through her chest. "What do you mean?" Tom set down his book and leaned forward on the counter. "Your grandmother was a good woman, Sarah. She understood her responsibilities, understood what the family owed." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Tom's eyes were very bright now. "Then why are you running?" Before Sarah could answer, Jake appeared at her side. "Mom, we should go." Tom looked at Jake with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "You've grown up strong, boy. Your grandfather would be proud." "You knew my grandfather?" Jake asked. "Oh yes. Thomas was a good man. Taught me a lot about the old ways, about the things that live in the deep woods and the prices we pay to keep them satisfied." Sarah grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to go." "Where?" Tom asked mildly. "Car's not going anywhere tonight, and you can't walk to Flagstaff. Too far. Too dangerous. We'll figure something out. I'm sure you will." Tom picked up his book again. "But Sarah, you might want to think about what's best for the boy. Some things can't be run from. Some debts follow you wherever you go." They left the store without buying anything. Outside, the parking lot felt even more isolated than before. The pursuing vehicle was gone, but Sarah didn't feel relieved. If anything, the absence felt more threatening than the presence had. "What did he mean?" Jake asked as they walked back to their car. "About Grandpa and the old ways." "I don't know," Sarah lied. But she was starting to understand. The journal entries, the town's strange behavior, the way everyone seemed to know more about her family than she did. It all pointed to something she'd never wanted to acknowledge. They spent the night in the car, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Sarah dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check the locks and scan the darkness for movement. Once around 3 a.m., she thought she saw figures moving between the parked trucks, but when she looked again, there was nothing. Jake slept more peacefully than she'd expected, but his sleep was full of whispered conversations. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. He was receiving instruction, learning. When dawn finally broke over the desert, Sarah tried the car again. It started on the first try, purring like it had never had a problem. They drove back to Millfield in silence. Sarah told herself it was practical. They needed a mechanic to look at the car, and Tom had been right. Jimmy's shop was the only option for 50 miles. But as they crested the hill overlooking the town, she knew the truth. They hadn't been allowed to leave, and now they were being drawn back like metal filings to a magnet. Jimmy's Auto Repair sat on the outskirts of town, a corrugated metal building surrounded by cars in various states of decay. Jimmy himself was a thin man in his 60s with grease-stained coveralls, and the same two bright eyes Sarah was beginning to recognize as a local trait. "Sarah Martinez," he said before she could introduce herself. "Heard you were in town." "Our car broke down last night," she said. "Could you take a look?" Jimmy walked around their rental car, running his hands along the hood and fenders like he was petting a dog. "Don't see anything wrong with her." "What kind of trouble were you having?" Sarah described the symptoms, the knocking, the grinding, the complete failure to start. Jimmy nodded along, but his expression was skeptical. "Tell you what," he said finally. "I'll put her up on the lift, take a proper look. But it might take a while. Parts are hard to come by out here." "How long?" "Day or two, maybe longer." Sarah felt the trap closing around them. "We're in kind of a hurry." "I'm sure you are," Jimmy said. "But some things can't be rushed." They walked back toward town, Jake quiet beside her. The morning sun made everything look normal. Just a small desert town trying to survive in the middle of nowhere. But Sarah could feel eyes on them from every window, every doorway. The weight of attention was almost physical. "There's something I need to tell you," Jake said suddenly. Sarah stopped walking. "What?" Jake looked around nervously, then pulled her into the shade of a closed storefront. "Last night in the car, I had dreams." "What kind of dreams?" "About Grandpa. He was teaching me things, showing me." Jake struggled for words. "He showed me the forest behind Grandma's house. But it wasn't just trees. There were paths, hidden places, and things living in them." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What kind of things?" "He called them the Nakani. Said they've been here longer than the town, longer than people. They're—" Jake frowned, trying to remember. "They're hungry, always hungry, and they can wear other shapes when they need to." The word Nakani hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard it before, years ago, whispered by her grandmother during a thunderstorm when Sarah was very young. Eleanor had told her it meant hungry ones in an old language that predated English in this part of the desert. "Jake," she said carefully, "these were just dreams." "Were they?" Jake looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his 17 years. "Because I remember things now that I never learned. Like where the keys to Grandma's house are hidden. Not just the one under the frog, but all of them. And I know which floorboards creak and which windows stick and—" He trailed off. "I know where Grandpa's body is buried." Sarah felt the world tilt. "Your grandfather is buried in the town's cemetery." "No," Jake said quietly. "That's just a marker. His body is in the forest. Has been for 30 years. The Nakani took him, but they gave something back. Something that looked like him, talked like him, but wasn't him." Sarah grabbed Jake's shoulders. "Stop. Just stop. Mom, I can see them now. They're all around us." Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. "In the store windows, in the cars driving by. They look like people, but they're not. They're wearing people-like clothes." Sarah looked around. The street seemed normal. A few locals going about their business, kids riding bikes, an old man walking his dog. But as she watched, she noticed the small things. The way the man walking his dog never blinked. The way the kids on bikes moved in perfect synchronization. The way everyone kept glancing in their direction. "We need to get back to the house," she said. "Why?" "Because running hadn't worked. Because the car would break down again if it tried to leave. Because something had been set in motion 30 years ago, and it was finally coming to its conclusion." But she couldn't say any of that to Jake. "Because I need to understand what's happening," she said instead. They walked back to her grandmother's house in silence. The front door was unlocked, though Sarah was certain she'd locked it the night before. Inside, the air was thick with that earthy scent, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Sarah went straight to her grandmother's bedroom and began searching through the dresser drawers, looking for more journals, more evidence. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old shawl, she found what she was looking for. A wooden box, carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Inside were more photographs, these ones old, black and white, showing people in old-fashioned clothes standing at the edge of the forest. And underneath the photographs, a bundle of papers tied with string. Sarah untied the string with trembling fingers. The papers were old, some of them handwritten, others typed on an ancient typewriter. At the top of the first page, in her grandmother's careful script, were the words, "The Millfield Covenant, 1954. Sarah read the first few lines and felt her knees go weak. "We, the founding families of Millfield, Arizona, do hereby acknowledge the presence of the Ancient Ones in the forest lands adjacent to our settlement. In exchange for their tolerance of our presence and their protection from the outside world, we agree to the following terms." The terms were simple and horrifying. Every generation, one family would provide a child to the Nakani. The child would be taken into the forest and taught the old ways, becoming a bridge between the human world and whatever dwelt in the deep woods. In return, the town would prosper, hidden from the outside world, protected from the economic disasters that had claimed so many other small towns. The families took turns. The Chins had provided a daughter in 1954. The Hendersons gave up a son in 1971. The Millers lost their youngest in 1988. And in 2025, it was the Martinez family's turn. Sarah's grandmother had signed the document with a shaking hand. Next to her signature was a note in faded ink. Thomas volunteered. Said it was better to give willingly than have them take by force. "Thomas," Jake's grandfather. Sarah heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly shoved the papers back into the box. Jake appeared in the doorway, but something was wrong with his face. His features seemed sharper, more angular. His eyes held a depth that hadn't been there that morning. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. His voice was different too. Older, more confident. "Jake," Sarah whispered. Jake tilted his head, studying her with an expression that was almost predatory. "I've been learning, Mom. Grandpa's been teaching me about our family's history, about our responsibilities." Sarah stood up slowly, the wooden box clutched in her hands. "What responsibilities?" "The same ones you've been running from your whole life." Jake stepped into the room, and Sarah noticed he was moving differently, more gracefully, like he was floating rather than walking. "The same ones your mother ran from, and her mother before her. My mother never ran from anything." "Didn't she?" Jake smiled, and his teeth seemed too sharp. "Why do you think she never brought you back here after you graduated high school? Why do you think she moved across the country and never spoke about her childhood?" Sarah backed toward the window. "You're not Jake. I'm more Jake than I've ever been," he said. "I'm who I was always meant to become. The Nakani are tired of waiting." Jake's form seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. 3 generations have refused the covenant. 3 generations have run rather than face their obligations. But bloodlines have power, Mom. And eventually, all debts come due. Sarah's back at the window. "What do you want?" "What we've always wanted. What was promised." Jake's face was shifting now, features flowing like water. A bridge between worlds. A child to carry the old knowledge forward. Someone to make sure the compact is honored. "And if I say no?" Jake's smile widened, showing teeth that definitely weren't human. "You already tried running. How did that work out?" Sarah looked down at the wooden box in her hands. The carved symbols seemed to be moving, writhing like living things. And in their movement, she could see the truth. The Nakani hadn't taken her grandfather 30 years ago. They'd made him an offer, become one of them, and his family line would be protected. His daughter would be allowed to leave, to live a normal life far from Millfield and its dark bargains. But the protection had come with a price. Eventually, the bloodline would have to return. Eventually, the debt would have to be paid. And now, with Sarah's grandmother dead and the covenant broken, the Nakani were done waiting. "There's another way," Sarah said desperately. "Is there?" Sarah thought about the journal entries, the town full of people who weren't quite people, the way everyone had watched them with hungry eyes. She thought about her grandfather's willing sacrifice and her grandmother's lifetime of guilt. And she made a choice. "Take me instead." Jake's inhuman smile faltered. "What?" "Take me instead of Jake. I'm the direct descendant. My bloodline, my responsibility." "Mom, no." And suddenly Jake was himself again, 17 and scared and completely human. "Don't listen to it. Whatever it is, don't." But the thing wearing Jake's face was already shaking its head. "Too late," it said. "The boy has the sight. He can see both worlds. You can't. Then teach me. Some things can't be taught to the unwilling. And you've spent your whole life running from what you are." Sarah looked at her son, seeing the terror in his eyes, the way he was pressing himself against the far wall as if he could somehow escape what was happening. "What am I?" she asked. The thing that looked like Jake studied her with ancient eyes. "You're the granddaughter of a medicine woman who forgot her medicine, the daughter of a seer who refused to see, and the mother of a boy who carries the old blood stronger than it's run in 4 generations." Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, like a door opening that had been locked her entire life. The old blood. Your grandmother tried to protect you from it, tried to raise you normal, human. But blood calls to blood, Sarah, and the Nakani had been calling for a very long time. The smell of earth and copper pennies was overwhelming now. Through the window, Sarah could see the forest, but it looked different than it had that morning. Deeper, more alive, and in its shadows, she could see movement. Things that might have been people, if people could bend light around themselves like water. "How long do I have?" she asked. "Until sunset," the thing said. "Then the boy comes with us, willing or not." And with that, it was gone. Just Jake, collapsed on the floor, gasping and shaking. Sarah ran to him, pulled him into her arms. He felt small and fragile, like the child he'd been before the world had gotten complicated. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to let it in. I was so curious about Grandpa, and when it started talking, I wanted to listen. It's not your fault. Sarah helped him to his feet. None of this is your fault. But as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Jake did have something that Nakani wanted. Some gift or ability that had been dormant in the family line for generations. And now that it was awakening, there was no putting it back to sleep. She looked out the window at the forest. The sun was already starting to sink toward the mountains. They had maybe 3 hours. Sarah opened the wooden box again and spread the covenant papers across her grandmother's bed. There had to be something she was missing, some loophole or escape clause. The Nakani were old, but they were also bound by rules. Contracts. Agreements. She read through the pages again, this time looking for specifics. The covenant required 1 child per generation, but it didn't specify which child. It mentioned voluntary surrender being preferable to force-taking, but it didn't say force-taking was impossible. And then, at the very bottom of the last page, she found it. A clause written in different handwriting, added years after the original document had been signed. In the event that the selected family line produces no viable candidates, the covenant may be fulfilled through the assumption of ancestral debt by the eldest living descendant. Sarah read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. If Jake couldn't be taken, if he was somehow protected or hidden, then the debt would fall to her, not as punishment, but as fulfillment of the original contract. She looked at Jake, who was sitting on the bed, still shaking from his encounter with whatever had worn his face. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "What?" "I need you to leave. Right now. Don't go back to the car. They'll be watching it. Cut through the woods behind the house and head for the highway. Flag down a truck, get to Flagstaff, catch a bus home." Jake stared at her. "I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." "Mom, listen to me." Sarah gripped his shoulders. "Whatever happens to me, you have to survive. You have to go back to Phoenix and live your life and never, ever come back here." "What about you?" Sarah thought about her grandfather, who had volunteered to protect his family. About her grandmother, who had spent 60 years carrying the weight of that sacrifice. About her mother, who had run as far as she could and never looked back. "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago," she said. "I'm going to stop running." The sun was touching the mountains when Jake finally left. Sarah watched from the bedroom window as he cut through the backyard and disappeared into the trees. She'd given him her credit cards, her phone, everything he might need to get home. Now she was alone in the house that had sheltered 4 generations of her family, alone with the shadows that were growing longer by the minute. Sarah went downstairs and opened the front door. The street was empty, but she could feel them out there, watching, waiting. She walked to the edge of the yard, where the grass gave way to desert scrub and the forest began. The trees seemed taller than they had that morning, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. "I know you're there," she said to the gathering darkness. "I know what you want." A figure stepped out from behind a pine tree. It looked like her grandfather, but she knew better now. It wore his face the way she might wear a coat. Familiar, comfortable, but not permanent. "You're early," it said in Thomas's voice. "I'm offering myself in exchange for the boy." The boy has already been chosen. The boy is gone. The thing wearing her grandfather's face smiled. "Is he?" Sarah's heart clenched. "You found him. We've been watching him since he was born, Sarah. Did you really think he could hide from us?" But there was something in its voice, a note of uncertainty that gave Sarah hope. "You haven't found him," she said. "If you had, you wouldn't be talking to me." The thing's smile faded. "He can't run forever. Maybe not, but he can run long enough." "Long enough for what?" Sarah pulled the wooden box from under her arm and held it up. "Long enough for me to destroy the covenant." The thing that looked like her grandfather took a step back. "You can't." "Can I?" Sarah opened the box and pulled out the old papers. "These are the only copies, aren't they? The only written record of the agreement. The covenant exists beyond paper and ink, does it?" Sarah struck a match. She found a book of them in her grandmother's kitchen. The flame danced in the evening breeze. "Let's find out. If you destroy the covenant," the thing said, "the protections end. The town dies. Everyone in it." Sarah looked back at Millfield, at the houses where lights were beginning to come on, at the people who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of this bargain. People who had watched her family sacrifice themselves generation after generation and never lifted a finger to help. "Maybe," she said, "it's time for that to happen." She touched the match to the corner of the first page. The paper caught immediately, burning with a flame that seemed too bright, too eager. The thing where her grandfather's face let out a sound like wind through dead leaves. "You don't understand what you're doing," it said. "I understand perfectly." Sarah watched the flames consume page after page of the covenant. "I'm ending it." As the last page turned to ash, something changed in the air around them. The pressure she'd been feeling since they arrived in Millfield, the sense of being watched, evaluated, hunted, suddenly lifted. In the distance, she could hear screaming. Sarah looked toward town and saw lights going out one by one. Not just electric lights, but something deeper. The life leaving the place, the unnatural vitality that had sustained it for 70 years, finally draining away. "You've killed them all," the thing said. "I've freed them." The thing that wore her grandfather's face was changing now, its features flowing like water. "And what about the boy? What about him? The covenant is broken, but the hunger remains. We are still here, still ancient, still in need of sustenance. If we cannot have what was promised, we will take what we can find." Sarah felt cold spreading through her chest. "You can't. The agreement is void, which means we're no longer bound by its restrictions." The thing smiled with teeth that weren't teeth. "Thank you, Sarah. You've given us something we haven't had in 70 years. "What?" "Freedom." The thing dissolved into shadow and mist, flowing away through the trees. And in the distance, Sarah could hear something else. A sound like thunder, or like 1,000 voices calling in a language that predated human speech. She ran back to the house and grabbed her grandmother's truck keys from the kitchen counter. The old Ford started on the first try, and Sarah drove toward the highway with her foot pressed to the floor. She found Jake 3 miles out, walking along the shoulder of the road. He got in the truck without a word, and they drove through the night in silence. Behind them, the sky above Millfield glowed red as something burned. But Sarah didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the life that waited for them beyond the reach of hungry things and old bargains. It wasn't until they reached Phoenix that Jake finally spoke. "Did you kill them all?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the faces in the windows, the 2 bright smiles, the way the entire town had felt like a stage set populated by actors who'd forgotten their lines. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I freed them." "From what?" Sarah parked in their driveway and looked at her son. In the porch light, he looked young again. Human. Just a 17-year-old boy who'd been through more than anyone should have to endure. "From us," she said. They went inside and locked the door behind them. But Sarah knew it wouldn't be enough. The covenant was broken, but the Nakani were still out there. Still hungry. Still ancient. And now they were free to hunt wherever they chose. That night, Sarah sat in her kitchen and wrote down everything that had happened. Everything she could remember about the covenant, the town, the things that wore human faces like masks. She sealed the pages in an envelope and addressed it to Jake, with instructions not to open it until he turned 30. By then, she hoped, he would be strong enough to understand what they'd escaped, and what might still be coming for them. Because in the distance, carried on the desert wind, Sarah could swear she heard something calling. Something that knew her name, knew her scent, knew the taste of her fear. The Nakani were patient. They had been waiting for 70 years. They could wait a little longer, but not forever. Never forever.